Just a question. Gentleman up front here.
I'm Mandefro from Oxfam. I will directly go to the question, no background. With the current approach, with the current tools and techniques we use, it's very difficult to cope up with the challenges we are facing. What are the changes in these institutions that takes place to cope up with this big challenge?
Okay, thank you so much. So maybe summarizing, we have questions about what can we do to prepare for what we know is coming. How do we change in the short term, not just in the long term? How do we build incentive systems for adoption of different practices? And what changes are necessary both to engage consumers and supply chains and to change the political system? So why don't we go around this time? Well, let's go back to Anne. So we go into this order. You always start, Anne.
I have the same issue that Robert has. Either I can see you or I can see my notes. So I think on the question of sort of the ex-ante action, you know, in many parts of the developed world, you know, farmers are already being given information about what varieties they should be planting and how they can be coping with these predicted events. And I think one challenge we have is actually to be able to get information to farmers and again, as I said in my talk, enable them to have access to the diversity of planting materials that they would need to respond to an upcoming El Nino event. It's not a similar case, but I was talking to colleagues from the 1 Acre Fund, and when the problem hit the new maize varieties that came out in Kenya and East Africa this past year, they had to very quickly pivot to start helping farmers get access to sorghum, millet, and other crops, which are going, and in some cases, native corn maize varieties that were more adapted. But it was a quick pivot and not so easy. And I think when we have these predictions like we do have with the El Nino, the important thing is for farmers to get the access to the information and access to the kinds of planting materials that they need. Charlotte, you asked the question on incentives yesterday, and I don't think you got a very good answer. I mean, Biodiversity just refreshed our strategy, and we actually deliberately put the issues around consumption first because of the recognition that consumers are starting to, it is a consumer demand-driven system, not as we have traditionally been thinking of it as a supply-driven system. Now, you know very well changing consumer behavior. I mean, that's a whole set of topics. But I do think we have to look towards building markets and using the market, working with private sector companies, working with governments. I mean, the school feeding programs could be, you know, a very excellent example of how to increase institutional demand for diversity. I think the other sets of incentives, you know, to the extent policies are encouraging farmers to plant certain crops. I mean, if you look at some countries that have had fertilizer subsidies, for example, those may be driving farmers to plant one set of crops and not another. And there might be other ways to provide support to farmers that would enable them to diversify production systems. So I think we need to think about a lot of different approaches to how we provide those incentives. And you know, the last thing I would look to, just because countries' budgets are limited, is some sort of payment for conservation of agricultural biodiversity. But I think they're important options, but maybe not in the situations we're talking about the first best option.
Thank you, and Robert, do you have something to add?
Well, it's sort of a difficult question. I mean, you can have sort of the very easy answer. I mean, hope for the best and plan for the worst, but you won't go very far with that. But I guess there is some truth in that. The fact is that we don't do that. We always hope for the best and don't do the rest. So in the end, we are surprised when we know that El Nino is coming, but who is doing something? Nobody really. It's the same case. I'm living in Indonesia, and there is a 75% chance that there will be a very severe El Nino year. So that means that there will be a lot of fire. That means that there will be a lot of haze. That means that the airport in Singapore will be closed for a few days and some people will die. Who is really doing something? Nobody. So I guess it goes back to the issue of incentive. I mean, so there is very little incentive to act before something wrong happens in our way of thinking, the overall way of thinking. And I think that's probably one thing we should change. I mean, we should reward people, the sort of, at this stage I will call them the doomsday calling people, because in the end, what is happening, and so that in my own country, in France, I mean, so people were preparing for this big epidemic of influenza, and it didn't happen. So because it didn't happen, everybody was happy now because we spent money to prepare for that. And of course, I mean, when you see that, you are not very well inclined to do, okay, I'm going to prepare for a disaster, I will invest, making some stock, preparing some seed store, putting in place a stabilization market for grain, removing some disincentive. Because if the crisis does not happen, it will go back to you, so you have spent the money and nothing happens. So you are one of these useless people that claim that tomorrow we all will die and we are still here. So I guess the point is that we should acknowledge that it is very likely it is happening. Shocks will be more frequent, problem will be more frequent, and we should include in part of our normal way of doing business, preparing for that. That's the only way, and I cannot give you, and I guess that the recommendation for Ethiopia will be very different to the recommendation for Equatorial Guinea, and will be very different for the recommendation to Greenland. But the principle should be like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, adaptation and building resilience is quite context specific, but the fundamental principles are the same. And being a continuum, ensuring that this can be done in such a way that it can continuously build upon, it's quite very essential. But there are certain situations where putting resilient measures or adaptation measures will not be able to address the shocks. But however, the impact could be lowered. If I take the case of Mozambique, where I mentioned an intervention where we restore mangroves and provided all our alternatives like crab farming and fish farming, when the Shai was struck by drought and flood, the impact comparatively to those impacts that happened when there was no action put in place were quite minimal. So actions being put in place to build resilience and increase climate change adaptation potential to reducing this resilience are quite very vital, but somehow they are also context specific. The second question on incentives, I think, is a very excellent question. How can we be able to ensure that all these actions that we're talking about can be upstream back to inform policy and at the same time become part of policy making? I think, as Anne indicated, at least what needs to be done is that there needs to be some public capital, for example, like knowledge, like investing in infrastructure and market. But at the same time, adaptation or resilience building should not just be seen as a social issue. It is a business. It helps create jobs. And some of the actions that have taken place across the continent and beyond have shown that jobs have actually been created. If I take the case of Togo, where in the northern part of Togo, despite the fact that the communities were suffering from water insecurity and traveling for long distance, affecting the girl child education, as a result of restoring some water retention potholes, there was not only availability of water, but at the same time, the usage of that water for brick construction created employment and opened up some entrepreneurship. Therefore, looking at adaptation as a business, and that investment in adaptation could help create jobs, especially in the African continent where you have 200 million youth at the moment, projected to reach about 400 million in less than 25 years from today, and especially the agricultural sector that could provide these jobs and put in place a kind of a value addition chain. For example, putting industries linking to market is quite very essential. And unless this is brought to the fore of policymakers and actually practically show them that the rising population will have to do business differently to slow the unemployment rate, it is something that is quite very vital. The last part is how can I preparing for the question was what should be done to prepare?
Yeah. Well, let's move on then. Okay. Maybe just one thing, since I'm sitting in the middle, I'll pick it up. Two interesting findings from, we've done about, probably together with Sri and the other members of the Economics of Climate Adaptation Group, about 25 to 30 studies on climate adaptation economics, not just in rural systems. And two things stood out. I think three things stood out. One is that there's generally a first batch of measures that are cost negative, which is like a stupid way of saying that they actually make money. And so in most systems, you do find some adaptation measure that can indeed be a business. Also that in most of these systems, and there are nature-based adaptation measures that have very, very low cost and have very high return for the expense. The third message, which is, maybe dousing the optimism of these first two, is that generally these two batches of measure don't get you more than 20-30% of the expected losses. And then you actually have to go to things that are more expensive, although they still have normally good cost-benefit ratios, but somebody will need to pick them up. And then potentially you need to go into risk transfer, which is the insurance person way to say buy insurance. Alisher.
Talking about adaptation, I think adaptation we can divide into two: private adaptation and public adaptation. And many studies show that very likely, as other panelists say, private adaptation may very likely, most of it can be ex post, unfortunately, because even from economic point of view, it would be unoptimal especially for a smallholder farmer to make investments to adapt to something which is not yet there. But there is undeniably there is a need for some kind of ex ante adaptation, and there is a role for public nudging of this kind of adaptation through changing incentive structures, and at the same time, even public action needs to be weigh cost against benefits, and in that so-called no-regret options, which are already useful even under these conditions, maybe perhaps first step to go for adaptation.
Okay, so to the question where to invest and what governments can do, I think we're starting to have okay tools to make recommendations in terms of sort of create scenarios and evaluate different portfolios of choices for government to decide basically what they want to do, where they want to invest their money, and which is a recent thing. I mean, these tools are getting better and they're very complex because generally they combine several modeling techniques. The problem, which is also a problem that goes to the question of incentives, is it's a time horizon sort of discount of the future kind of problem, because which is similar to what some of you were saying. Some of these systems, they do appear to be profitable in the long run, but they also have clear barriers at the very beginning, either in terms of investments or even higher risks. And this is sort of, that could explain, at least in part, why you see those negative costs at the beginning, right? But nobody picks up on them, right? So there must be a reason for why people are not doing it. And generally, these barriers are there, and there are barriers either for decision makers who might not have an immediate clear return by making these decisions, or for the farmers themselves who don't see these returns given their very short sort of time horizon in terms of decision making.